So, well, good afternoon, almost good evening. In German we say, the letzte beißen die Hunde, the last is bitten by the dogs. And the problem is also, if you're the last, almost everything has been already said. So I'm almost embarrassed to stand up here now and to talk about something very similar to what Equinor has been so nicely being presenting. So yeah, I have a bit of a problem. Yeah, this was just a recapitulation, and also I wasn't quite sure who was talking about what, and so in detail. We have the policy instruments, as Equinor rightly said, but actually what is missing is the implementation of the policy instruments. There was now the Resource E policy document that goes one way, but I think if you have ever seen the report by the European Court of Auditors of the CRM policy, the assessment, it's very disheartening to read all that, what the Commission has been doing all wrong. Or not sufficiently. I hope they don't listen, or maybe they should listen actually. Because yes, the implementation aspects are totally missing, and then they actually misunderstand the economics, they misunderstand the business of what really happens in the world. Well, I'm basically skipping the slide because you probably have already read it by now. So what I was going to talk about is how actually to provide a bit of a reality check after all the science and technology we've seen today. How to make that actually interesting for investors, for the people who are supposed to be paying for what we have been developing, to put this into real action. Unlike what the European Commission tends to think, no one actually really uses the UNFC until they are really forced to. So for the investors, they usually base their decision on the CRISCO assessment. And the problem is that the CRISCO assessment has been developed for hard rocks. For solid mineralizations, I should say. But we're not dealing here with solid mineralizations, we're dealing here with the different systems. So with the CRISCO assessment, we try to find out what's the project viability. We try to assess the risk, what business risks are there. And we make sure that what's being disclosed from a project is comparable to what other projects are disclosing. So that provides the basis for going to the stock exchange and saying, well, this is what our project is likely to be valued, how viable it's going to be. And therefore that what the investors might be prepared to pay, to put money into the system. So basically all the UNFC classifications you've just heard about by Janos, they are actually based originally on a UNFC, on a CRISCO assessment, because that's what the mining companies do in the first place. Now for the oil industry, it's a bit different. I'm not very familiar with the oil industry, but they have similar instruments like that as well. So why UNFC? Well, the UNFC is actually an instrument in order to look at the strategic availability of the raw materials. So whether these things are now commercially viable or not is for the UNFC not so relevant. Or for the European Commission is not interested whether something is now commercially viable or not, because that may depend on the price. And you just heard that prices can be very volatile up and down. So the viability of a project may vary very quickly. So a lot of lithium projects went down the drain because the lithium price collapsed a couple of years ago. But we want still to know first from strategic point of view how much is actually there. How much, depending we got the right technology, how much we got the right amount of money people are prepared to for the product. How much could we actually extract? And therefore, that's what UNFC helps to assess. Because that also, UNFC also is able to assess, or to classify rather than to assess, the non-viable resources. So for strategic planning, for policy decisions, and for looking at the supply risk management, which is the criticality aspect of that. I'm not going into that, you just heard that from Janos. I just put it there in case Janos didn't talk about it before. Now, there are also now map documents, so-called bridging documents, how to map the CRISCO the CRISCO assessment into a UNFC classification. Now this works very well for solid minerals. But again, we're not dealing here with solid minerals. We're extracting liquid, and we're actually extracting two different value streams from the liquid. We extract the mineral and we extract the energy in form of heat from it. And that also causes a problem for the UNFC classification up to a point. Because, you heard that already, more or less, the reservoirs for the heat and for the mineral are not the same. You extract from different volumes. So the drawdown, so the timeline for the development will be different. So any project that you're talking about will be different for the heat and for the minerals. And as you just heard, the definition of a reservoir in a fractured hard rock is not so easy. The oil industry has a very good idea about that, and Equinor talked about that very briefly, because they think in terms of porous reservoirs usually. In fact, the Canadian Institute of Mining just proposed a way of assessing these kind of lithium extraction from brines. But when you read this, you hear that you see that it's written by a petroleum engineer, because they think it's a finite resource. But we have also the problem that the lithium is being recharged into the brine, not always, but sometimes. So all that also has an influence on the project duration, on the project viability. So, in fact, we need to think about different ways of assessing these reservoirs, and that is, as was already quite rightly identified, one of the main challenges in the whole process. And that's currently what also the UNFC people are struggling with. And perhaps also to mention, there has been a bit of a bad feeling between CRISCO and UNFC, because the CRISCO people thought, well, UNFC is going to be a competing system, and the industry was a bit confused. Why does the Commission suddenly expect from us, say, for instance, for the strategic projects, the so-called to do a UNFC classification, we already do the CRISCO assessment. We actually convened a couple of meetings over the last couple of years, and now they talk nicely together. So they understand each other. I had actually dinner with the two head guys there, and we understand now each other and what's going on there. And so, how do we deal with all these very complex problems? We have to classify, we have to separate different products. We have to identify really the products we are taking out. And we have to have qualified experts for each of the products. This is the difficulty. When you do a CRISCO assessment or when you do a UNFC classification, you normally have an expert in lithium, an expert in copper, an expert whatever type of mining. But here we need to have different people. We need to have someone who knows something about lithium, minerals, and geothermal energy. So that's something new. We need to identify proper sub-projects, and that's sometimes not so easy. So we certainly have to have the mineral project and we have to have the energy project on one side. Now, reference point definition, this was mentioned by Janos already. It's not so easy either. People recommend actually to use as a reference point the sellable product from that point on. So what goes into the market? Could be also a technical point where, say, both value streams come together. And you need also a comprehensive conceptual model of what your system actually looks like. You've seen already some of the models being discussed here. In order to really identify the different parts of your system properly, and to identify these reference points and the value streams in your system, and also to identify what goes into your system in additional materials that you may consume, reactants and so on, which is quite unlike what happens in many mining operations, not in the processing but in the mining. Because here we combine actually, to a certain degree, mining and processing into one process, which is for the mining industry a little as such. They're two separate things. They also form then the basis for the detailed material and energy assessment, which in turn is also needed for the economic assessment as well as for the environmental impact assessment. If you do something very nice, but with some material, the production of which is pretty nasty, your environmental balance may not look, or energy balance may actually not look very nice in the end. There are also certain process interdependencies, because you may actually use some of the energy that you extract from the geothermal system in your chemical processes to heat parts, to generate energy. You may use some of the energy that your system produces, or harvests rather. You may actually use internally in your, if you have a steam turbine that drives a generator, the electricity you can use internally in your system for whatever pumping, etc. And that goes into your calculations as well, and in your CRISCO calculations and so forth. I already mentioned that the depleting timelines are not very easy to assess. I just mentioned the internal energy utilization. There are also points where there's a risk of double counting something. So you have to look at that very, very carefully. And I just mentioned also the competency requirements for the assessment, CRISCO assessment, as well as for the UNFC classification may be different for the mineral part as well as for the geothermal part. So both systems, CRISCO assessment as well as the UNFC classification, is more complex than just the geothermal one or just the mineral. Now, the CRISCO people have been struggling with that. And because actually we kicked off this discussion in both CRISCO and UNFC. The project kicked off this discussion because I also gave them that material and said, hey guys, look at the reports and what do you think about the things and how would you like to react to that? So we gave that to the expert group, the minerals expert group in UNFC. We gave that to expert group on geothermal in UNFC, and we gave that to PERC, this is the European arm of GRISCO, to think about it. And they said, oh yeah, that's right, we haven't really thought about it, the PERC people. That's a problem. The reservoirs are a problem, and the replenishment is a problem, because that's something we're not dealing with in mining normally. So this is a true outcome in the real sense of the word outcome. Actually, the PERC has set up now a working group on brines, on the salars as well as on the geothermal brines. First meeting was last week, so that's very, very fresh news. And UNFC also thinks about it, and we had discussions with the geothermal working group, and we have a joint paper now on joint poster actually on the World Geothermal Congress in Calgary in autumn. So that was a very quick rundown of these things, and I'm almost embarrassed to have said all these things after some of the nice presentations here. Thank you very much for your patience anyway.